All have been.
Welcome to the opening act of Declarative Amsterdam 2021. In the coming 2 hours, I will try to teach you some of the fundamentals of XProc. And I know that XProc is not a very popular or well-known language, so I'll start with the assumption that you don't know much about it. So we'll start at the very beginning of the language with the fundamentals. It also means that since we have only 2 hours or so, we will not get to the deep end of the pool. Actually, I'm pretty unsure how far we'll get anyway, because I'm not sure how long exercises will take and stuff like that, but we'll get at least past the fundamentals of the language. During... Okay, is this better?
It's okay.
Okay, good. During the tutorial, there will be several exercises that you can follow along. If you want to do that, you should have done some preparation. So, are there actually any people here in the room or online that want to follow along using and actually do the exercises? Yeah. Oh, that's good. There, the preparations are there. I hope you've all done it and tried and tested it and stuff like that. So we'll see what happens. I also would like this tutorial to be somewhat interactive. So if you have a question, or I'm not clear enough, or you want me to talk a little bit more about something, just raise your hand here in the room, or if you're online, please put it on the Zoom chat, and Peter there will give me a wave that there's somebody who has a question or wants something. So let's get started. I promise you, this is the most boring sheet of the whole presentation. This is me. Maybe the only thing to take away of that is that I'm a member of the XProc editing committee, and I also wrote a programmer's reference about the language, so I kind of know what I'm talking about. And then I'll try to get some knowledge out of my head into yours today. All right, so what is XProc? Let's start at the very beginning. XProc is a XML-based programming language in which you can declare pipelines, which means that you can push documents through pipelines and do all kinds of processing on them. It consists of a set of small tools that you can chain together to produce the wanted output. It's a bit like Unix, like Unix pipelining on the command line, doing something small, doing something else small, and refining your results. There is a version 1.0. It has been around since 2010, but it was never very popular, and that was because it was very verbose, and it was very hard to get past to climb the learning curve, to find out what you had to do. And if you got behind that, it's actually a very useful tool in the box. We now have a specification for 3.0. It's in last call status. It has been in last call status for, I think, over a year or so. And we hope that we will very soon be able to finalize it and make it definite standard. There is one working processor, Morgana, which I ask you to install. And there is one on the way, which is the XML Calabash version 3 made by Norman Walsh. But he's almost there, but not quite yet. I saw a beta version online already, but it's not yet production ready. Anyway, Morgana is by Achim Berndzen, who is also a member of the XProc editing committee. Why should you bother? I mean, well, pipelining is a very ubiquitous thing all around us, even if you don't realize that. You can solve problems in a very elegant way by pushing it through a pipeline, and it happens all around us. I mean, oil refineries are, of course, a primary example of using pipes, but also your CPU in your laptops, it's based on pipelining, or car factories with a conveyor belt that slowly people put together a car. It's also a typical example of what you might call pipelining. And it turns out to be a very natural choice if you do complex document processing, especially when I probably have all encountered situations that it would be easy that we're converting a document with an XSLT, but it would be easier if you could split the XSLT in smaller ones, because you put the result of one into the other. That's typically a scenario that you can do with XProc. I also know that there are a lot of homegrown alternatives out there. People have created pipeline applications. I mean, there was Cocoon a long time ago. I heard yesterday that it's still alive, but Cocoon, I did a lot of Cocoon. But there are also private homegrown stuff, but XProc really beats the alternatives because we really thought things through. XPath is completely integrated into it. And I think so. I think that's good. What I would like you to do now, for all that are following along, I would like to do a little pre-flight check whether all your whether the technical setup works. So the first bullet is the preparations. If you've done that, then there is what you might go to exercises/01 hello XProc on a command line prompt. And then type Morgana space pipeline.xpl. And does that work? Yeah, I see people nodding. Any reactions online, Peter?
No reactions online.
Okay, that's maybe silent is good. Yeah? All right. Let's assume that it all went okay. Okay. So if this works, then you can follow along with the exercise.
Erik, I have a question.
Yeah.
Someone is asking, I have to use Morgana.sh
Yeah.
to run Morgana. That's all right?
Sorry again.
He said, I have to use Morgana.sh to run Morgana instead of Morgana. What do I miss? Is this a Linux variant that you...
SH, oh shell, yeah, that's probably that he's working on a Linux computer. All right, that's good thing. If you're on a Linux computer, it's probably Morgana.sh, the command. Yeah, okay. Okay, good. I missed that because I'm a Windows user. Right. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start with the fundamentals of XProc, right at the very beginning. Okay, XProc is the basic things in XProc are pipelines and steps, and as we're going to see, these things are interchangeable. What is a pipeline? A pipeline is something where you use documents as input, you push them through a series of steps to refine them, change them, merge them, split them, whatever, and you produce one or more outputs. For instance, what you see here, you could say that input one could be a output from some kind of weather channel, input two could be geographical data, and what you produce after on the output would be a nice HTML page that shows you the weather in various places in the world, or something like that, doesn't matter. As the fish says, documents can be any type, and we will get back to that. Or there are a lot of types of documents you can push through the pipeline. So once you've in XProc created such a pipeline, you can reuse this step as in a larger pipeline. I mean, you can create pipelines can be building blocks in bigger pipelines. So then let's get what is a step. A step is actually the same as a pipeline. A step is something that takes inputs, does something with them, and produce outputs. So pipeline and step are interchangeable concepts in XProc. Wherever there's where you say pipeline, you can say step or vice versa. It's completely interchangeable. So, yeah. Okay, what document types can we push through a pipeline in XProc? Well, there's of course XML. XML is its first-class citizen. It came from an XML background, and XML is its first-class citizen. But we added some other nice things in the 3 version. One is HTML. HTML actually goes through your pipeline as sanitized XML, so it will be sanitized into XML, and then you can push it through your pipeline. But you can still distinguish between the various types because you can look at the MIME type of the document in your pipeline if you want to. Then there's JSON. You can actually working with JSON in an XProc pipeline is very well supported. JSON goes through a pipeline as a data structure. If you put a JSON document through your pipeline, it runs through it as a map or an array or whatever the JSON is. And then you can query this data structure in your pipeline. You can change it, whatever. Then we have text. Well, text is just text, of course. It runs through your pipeline if you are familiar with XDN as a text node, text node in an XML sense. And also binary. Well, I have to say, with binary files, you can't do very much at the moment. But you can run them through your pipeline, and you don't. Please don't be afraid that it will take up too much of your memory, because probably binary will run through it not as a blob in memory, but as references or whatever. It's quite efficient. The only thing that is useful in binary sense is that you can work with zip files. You can push a zip file through a pipeline. You can look at the contents of the zip file, extract files, or if you want to, you can also create a new zip file with all kinds of contents in it, and use that and produce that as an output of your pipeline. So that's a very useful application of binary files in XProc. But we're not going to talk about that today, unfortunately. But there are examples online of how you can do that. So let's get back to the steps or to pipelines. And to say something about it, let's have a look at one of a very fundamental step in XProc, which is the p-add attribute, which, no surprise, adds an attribute somewhere in the XML in your document. So what are the things you have to deal with if you work with XProc? And this, and we use p-add attribute as an example. Well, all steps, or all pipelines, have ports, and ports are the things the documents flow in and out. So p-add attribute has a source port through which a document flows in, an XML document in this case, or an HTML document. And of course, it also has a result port through which documents flows out. Ports are important concepts in XProc. Besides ports, steps can have options, and options are the little switches you can set to make things happen. And p-add attribute has 3 options. One is the match option, which tells the attribute step where to add the attribute, and of course there's an attribute name and an attribute value option to set the actual attribute. It's a little bit like these boxes in the air ventilation system with switches on them that change the mode or something. It's a nice analogy. p-add attribute is part of a step library, and there are several step libraries in XProc. One is the standard steps, and all XProc conformant processors must implement the standard steps, otherwise they're not conformant. And there are about 45 steps in the standard step library: add, attribute, insert. We're going to see a few during this tutorial. Then there are a number of additional steps, like working with files, working with the operating system, doing validation. These steps are optional, so the processors do not have to implement them, but the 2 I know of do. And they're actually, but if for instance, a processor implements a validation step, it should be like we described there. That's the rule we've set for it. Okay, let's have a look at an XProc program. And this XProc program does something very complicated. It adds an attribute to the root of a document. I know all examples today will be very simple, but I hope you whet your appetite, and maybe you can see further than the simple stuff I'm going to show you today. So what components do we have here that you need to be aware of? The first thing is that a XProc pipeline starts with p-declare step. As already said, step and pipeline are interchangeable subjects. So there is no p-pipeline, it's p-declare step. We declare a step. We have a namespace for XProc and preferred prefix p. And you have to set the version explicitly to 3.0 for a 3.0 processor to be able to do something with. Then we say we have an input port, source. We have an output port called result. And inside our step, we invoke another step, and we invoke the p attribute. Yes?
The port names special names, or can you choose anything?
You can choose anything. There are no colon names, XML no colon names, but source and result are conventions. So if you, I'll get to that, but it's a convention to name your most important port, source and result. So then you'll find in the standard step library that all steps there have source and result ports. But you can choose anything. But we'll get to adding other ports with other names today, right? So inside our step, we invoke the p attribute, and we specify the options for the p attribute, as I told you, by specifying them as attributes on the p attribute. So we say a match, we do it on the root attribute, we call the attribute timestamp, and the value actually it's interesting, it's an attribute value template, like you're probably used to doing XSLT. You can put stuff between curly braces, the result is specified, and that will be the value of this attribute. This was a feature that was lacking in 1.0, which made things very difficult, and it actually helps a lot that we can do this now. So this is a very, very, very basic XProc pipeline. All right. What I want you to do is see if this actually works. So if you go to exercise 02 at attribute and you run this command line, and for the Unix users, it's morgana.sh. See if actually the attribute is added. All right. So why did this work? Actually, it's because it's surprising. We have, yeah.
Maybe it's too much detail.
Yeah.
Someone would say he got an error message. Resource for port source not found. Maybe you got the wrong file name or something.
You should say input source is input.xml.
Okay.
You have to tell Morgana which document to provide on the input port.
People are helping each other on the chat, so I think you can continue.
Okay, good. Fine. All right. Why is this working? We have ports, and how actually does the XProc processor know what to feed through what port? And that is because of a very important concept, and it's called primary ports. Not all ports are created equal. Some ports are primary. And usually, a step has a primary input and a primary output port. There can only be one. Can we close the door? Can someone usually we have we can only have one primary input and one primary output port, and most steps, of course, have both because something flows in and something flows out. And the port names for the primary ports are source and result by convention. And if you're ever going to do any real XProc, I'll suggest you stick to that because that makes things much easier to follow along for another programmer. And why are they so important? That is because if you write steps in your pipeline, primary ports automatically click together. So if you have up there a p something and below that it be something else. What flows out of the primary port of be something automatically flows into the primary port of be something. Nothing you have to do about it, no programming at all required. It just works. They implicitly connect. It's called implicit connection in XProc. And that goes even further. If you have a step like we have here with two, a pipeline with two steps, step P something and step P something else. Then first, how does it know what is the primary port? Well, if you only have two ports, one input and one output port, they're primary by default. If you have more ports, then you have to explicitly tell the XProc processor which one is primary, with the primary is true false attribute. We'll get to that. The first thing is, because of the whole primary port idea, is that what flows into your pipeline through the primary input port automatically flows to the input port of your first step, the first step in your pipeline. And from there, as I told you, by implicit connection, it flows to your next one. And from there, because P something else is the last step in your pipeline, it flows back to the primary output port of your pipeline. So this is all very intuitive. It's like you probably would expect it, but it's built through this whole primary port mechanism. And you need to be aware of that if your pipelines get more complex, but this is what actually happens because of this whole implicit connection stuff. So, with that in mind, I would like to ask you to change the pipeline in CO2 add attribute to add another attribute somewhere in your document. Think of something you can, doesn't matter what attribute where. So please change the pipeline.xpl that it adds a second attribute somewhere. Well, let's get to the solution, right? And that's of course very easy, because the only thing you had to do if you've done that, is add a second p add attribute behind the first one, or before the first one, that wouldn't matter in this case. That adds another attribute, because what comes out of the first p add attribute automatically flows into the second. So it will get executed and another attribute will be added. That's quite easy. All right. Any questions so far? Because this whole implicit connection thing is important, so I hope you grasp it. Yeah.
May I ask about the attribute value here? In the first step, it's some function that's calculated. In the other one, is it just a string?
It's just a string, yeah. Anything between curly braces should be an XPath expression. And if they're not, if you don't put any curly braces around, it's just a string. It's just a string, yeah. Right. Okay, this is about implicit connection. Things that XProc will automatically do for you. But we also have explicit connections. And explicit connection is what can we do if we want to explicitly connect a port to something. And there are three things, probably more, but there are three primary things you can do with explicit connection. You're going to connect a port to an inline document. This is a document or data that is in your pipeline itself, a fixed document. You can connect to an external document, a document on disk or on the web. And you can connect it, and here it gets really interesting, to another port in your pipeline. So let's start with the first one. Sorry, we'll start with introducing the p insert step, because that's the step that's very good at introducing this whole concept. What does p insert does? Well, it puts one piece of XML here. That's about the rough idea. And of course, we have an input. We have ports on the p insert step. We have a source port where the base document flows in. But we also have an insertion port where the stuff that you want to insert in your base document flows in. Another XML stuff flows in through your insertion port. And of course, it has an output port, results, that where the combined document flows out. It also has several options. One is the match option, which tells you where in your input document it should introduce it, and it has a position, and which has a number of fixed values, which is first child, last child, before or after. I think it's pretty clear what it does. If it matches on a certain element, we want it before the element or after the element, or the first child inside the element, or the last child inside the element. So that tells the insert step where to insert what comes into the insertion port. As the fish says, the source and the result port are primary, so you can rely on implicit connection for them. But the insertion port is not. It is not a primary port because there can be only one primary input port. So you need to explicitly connect it, otherwise nothing will happen. So how can we do that? The first thing you can do is connect it to an inline document. And for explicit connections, you always write a P with input. You have the step. In this case, it would be P insert, but for the example, it says P sum step. And you say P with input. Port is the port name, which should be insertion in this case. And between the P with input, as a child of the P with input, you write the document you want to get inserted. Explicit connection is always done using P with input. In your inline documents, you can also do things with curly braces. You can do them in attributes as text value templates, attribute value templates, as we already saw. But you can also do them in the text parts of the XML.
Maybe if you stand close to the microphone.
All right, I'll try. Good. So you can do things with curly braces in your document. Those that are already used to XSLT3 know that it has this as well. So what I want you to do now is to add an additional child element using an inline document with P insert. If you open Theo3 Connect Inline, then I would ask you to add an insert for, in this case, a presenter element, to add the location element after the presenter element. And there are various hints there on the sheet.
Yeah. A question by John Lemley. Can you turn off the TVT so you can write your own braces?
Yeah,
how do you escape them?
Yes, you can turn off the TVTs by doubling the curly braces.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And someone else asks, Sid Bauman, where is the schema? Schema. Well, I suppose you're referring to that.
Yes, all information can be found via xproc.org. And there are links there to whatever you need.
I'll write it in the chat.
Yeah.
I was confused by Oxygen that has a red line for it with input.
That's correct, because XProc 1 doesn't have an P with input statement. And it still validates it against XProc 1 schema.
But good to mention.
Maybe you should repeat the question.
Yeah. All right. The question here in the room was that the people were confused because in Oxygen you get red squiggly lines, for instance, under the P with input, and that's correct because the Oxygen still validates against the version 1.0 schema and not against the version 3.0 schema. So you will get validation errors anyway into XProc 3 in Oxygen.
Is there anything we can do about that?
Yes, but that's complicated. I will not go into that. All right. I think we should get, because of time, we should continue, and I will show you what you should have done, which is this. So we have our step, and we have an insert, a P insert, which says matches / star, position is last child, and we put on the insertion port a location element, which is actually just an inline XML document. This is just a single element, but it could be as complicated as you would like it to be. And in that, but that was optional, you can see I put in a text value template between curly braces that computes the current year. Okay, anybody that guessed this? Something like this?
I had that with input element outside of the insert. That doesn't work.
No, that doesn't work. No, the PV input it's because it's it connects the input port of this insert step, so it must be a child of the P insert.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So that's how you connect to an inline document, and that inline document can be flexible because of attribute value templates and text value templates. Okay, a very common thing that you probably do a lot is connect a port to an external document, to a document on disk or on the web. It all depends on the protocol you put in front of the URL there. You do that by placing an href attribute on the PWIF input. So you say href is a reference to a document. For now, this is going to be easy because the document you're going to reference to is in the same directory. So you can just write the file name. If you ever want to go to another directory, you have to put file:/ in front because you need the protocol specifier in front of it, or HTTP, of course, if you get it from the web. But the examples here are easy. Everything is in the same directory, so you can work with relative file names. So you write the href, and you can use attribute value templates in the href, which is not so useful at this moment because I haven't told you that we have variables and stuff like that. But if you, for instance, if you have a directory name in a variable inside your pipeline, you can use that to produce a full URL or something you want to do, like all this fun and juggling. So here's another exercise. Back to work. What I want you to do is you connect, go to exercise 03 connect inline, and there's a file there, insert.xml, and I want you to insert it after the presenter element. Okay, so there's an error on this sheet that should be 04 connect. What is it? What is it? External. 04 connect external. Sorry for that. The question is the is the href just a URL, or is it anywhere x-include aware? No, it isn't. But if you want to do x-include, there's a p-x-include step. So you have to, we'll get to that, push your document here through an x-include before you insert it. And that's something you can very easily do in XProc pipeline. But maybe not today, but something you can do. Yeah.
Some people are asking if there are any options for a nice indenting.
Yes, there are, but I'm not getting to that today.
Okay.
Yes, you can put there's a serialization option on the output port.
Like an XML too.
Yeah, yeah. But it's not in the tutorial today.
Okay.
But yes, there is.
As an exercise.
Yeah.
So what is the expected output? The document with another tutorial element?
With a with a tutorial element as the last element.
Present.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let's look about how that about the solution. It's like this. Actually, we say we have an insert step and we link the insertion port to the insert.xml document. That's all in this case. Quite easy.
I would think that port insertion is superfluous.
Why?
Because I'm thinking, yeah, there's an insert and you're saying this is the input So maybe I don't understand.
Okay. The question is, or the remark was, maybe the insertion port is superfluous. Well, it isn't. How should the P insert step know what to insert? It must get it from somewhere, and that it gets it from what is put on the insertion port. Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, just the attribute port insertion is part of the context. So, I mean, there is no other port, or is there a different port that I could connect to?
No, the P insert step had 3 ports: source, insertion, and result. That's all. If you look at the definition in the step library, you can find that.
I accidentally used port source, and then it told me that wasn't bound.
Yeah, then you get into complicated scenarios. Yeah, yeah. So it would tell you that the insertion port, which is mandatory to put something on the insertion port, and then we give you an error message that you didn't put anything on your insertion port. So the insert step must know what to insert, and it inserts what you put on the insertion port. That's the whole idea.
More importantly, it needs to have a value for the port.
Yeah, it needs. Yeah. There need to be something on that port.
Yeah.
There needs to be a document on that port, otherwise it can't insert anything. All right. So let's get into somewhat more deeper waters and see what we can do by connections inside your pipeline, because whatever you do in your pipeline, you can explicitly connect to stuff. And we're going to do that by adding first. We're going to do that simple, relatively simple, is by adding another port, input port, to the step we are creating. So we've done a pdeclare step. We're creating a step, and we want an additional input port on that step. And we call that additional input port extra. Could have been anything, but we call it extra. And we want to connect later on what comes in through the extra port to the insertion port of our P insert step. So how does that work? First, we need to add an additional port to the step we are creating, to the thing we're writing, what we are programming. So we say another P input statement, and we say it's not a primary port, and we call it extra. That's what this says. So that's it. But we now also have to explicitly tell the XProc processor that our other input port, called source, is a primary port, because it now sees two input ports. It doesn't know any longer which one is the primary one. So we explicitly have to tell the XProc processor that this is a primary port. And just for completeness sake, I also added primaries to the output ports. That is not strictly necessary, but I edited it to show you that you can do that also. Okay, so we have declared an additional input port on our step where we can push another document in. So how are we going to use that? That is not more complicated. The first thing that you should know is that if you want to connect to a port of something in an XProc processor, this something, whether it is the outermost declare step or one of the innermost or one of the steps inside your pipeline, needs to have a name. So there is a name declaration there. This says that my pipeline is called internally. It's an internal name. It's not visible on the outside. And I called it my pipeline, but you could have called it anything which is valid in XML. So you have to give it a name. And then what we're saying is we want the extra port on our outermost pipeline connected to the input port, the insertion port of our P insert. So what we write there is pipe. We say we do extra at my pipeline. So my pipeline refers to the outermost one. There's an extra port in that, so we say extra port at my pipeline. we use the pipe attribute. There are other means to connect things, but this is the most easy one. Is that clear here? Yeah. So give something a name, and at that moment you can address all the ports on that thing you just named with these @sign constructions there.
Yeah, I think this is one of the big improvements of XProc 3.
Yes, the @sign. The @sign indeed in XProc 1 you had to write a lot more code for that. You can still do that; it's still there. The possibility for that, but this is one of the bigger syntactic sugar things in XProc. All right. So what I want you to
question, Erik, there's another question from the Creative Amsterdam.
It's him.
And he asks, is there a default value for the primary attribute? The input primary is true. If you leave it out, what does it mean?
There's only a default value if you only have one input and then one output port. Then it's true. Otherwise, there's no default value. Right.
But there's nothing connected to the extra port.
No, that's right. Because as soon as we invoke, if we are going to invoke this pipeline then we on the command line, we have to connect something to the extra port. We have to say to Morgana, hey, there's an extra port there. Please connect this document to it. We'll get to that.
So we need another input parameter.
Yeah. The question was, there's nothing connected, and we need another input parameter on the command line to connect something to the port. Right. So here's another exercise. Oh, no, this one. Here's another exercise. Forget the last bullet for now. The first question is, just try this program. It's there. I mean, you don't have to type anything. Just try it. And as you can see on the command line, you'll have to type. You have to connect the extra port to. You have to connect a document to the extra port for the insertion. Right. That's the easy part. You're already done. Yeah. Okay. And now this is a bit abstract. We'll get it and not very useful, but we'll get to more useful stuff around connecting ports later. What I want you to do is to reinsert what comes in on the source port back into the document. As you can see, what's there in yellow is the original document. And what I would like to do is change the pipeline so it reinserts what comes in on the source port back into the document. No? Okay, this yellow stuff there, right? What here? This. Yeah, that's the original document you start with. So what I actually want you to do is, after you've inserted the location using the extra port, I want you to reinsert the original document back into itself by using another p insert with another pipe attribute, p with input pipe attribute. Difficult, but nonetheless enlightening. Yeah. It seems easy. It is easy once you know how to do it, but that's with everything.
And Norm has mentioned how to serialize.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Norm.
That I like on the blackboard while you're talking, or people can consult it. Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's see how this should work. It's like this. The last p insert is the one you should have written. So what you actually do there is, again, as a last child of the root element, you insert what comes in on the source port of your outer pipeline. Is that a solution that people, asking in the room, people found out themselves? Yeah. So you actually just connect to that and then it reinserts it again.
There is a question maybe for later. Someone, Alan Painter, says there is a GitHub project, Transpect, that has a large corpus of XProc pipelines, and he wonders if there are more of such projects. Noted.
I don't hear you. Now I do.
Right. Yeah, and now here. Right. All right, I think we should continue with this XProc tutorial. There were a number of questions and remarks during the break. One is a confusion about my identity. I am not a Daan Vernooy. I'm Erik Siegel, but Zoom displays me as Daan Vernooy. And that's because my laptop had some severe difficulties running Zoom and the presentation at the same time. I had no idea why, but Daan's laptop came to the rescue, so that's why I'm now Daan. The second question was about, or second remark was about the white space. That if you did the exercises, that the white space came out differently than I showed on the sheet. Yes, that's true. But you can, and I think that's on the Zoom. I heard that's on the Zoom chat now. You can control how the white space should be handled in the output on your output port. So, but the sheets are. I try the sheets to be as clear as possible, and indeed, if you run it, it comes out a little differently. But the idea is the same. Right. Are there any other pressing questions or remarks at this moment? Online, anything?
No.
No. Oh yeah, there was a remark about Transpect, that there is indeed that it was on one of the first slides. There is a large corpus of XProc 1 pipelines from Litec, a German firm, and as far as I'm aware, that's the only very big XProc 1.0 project there is. But of course, I can't oversee the world, but that's the one I'm aware of, the only one I'm aware of.
Maybe you can also say something, or maybe later, about conversion of 1.0 to 3.0.
The remark is that maybe we should say something about the conversion from 1.0 to 3.0. I will see if we have some time at the end if we can say it. But the answer is it's difficult. Okay. All right. Let's continue and see if we can make this whole port connection mechanism do something actually useful, because this is of course not a very useful example. Hello. Yeah. All right. This is a scenario that you will often encounter in a real pipeline. You have something coming in this case, your extra port. And you want to change this. In this case, we're only going to add an attribute, but you can probably imagine that you might want to, for instance, first put a filter on it, throw elements away, or do an XSLT over it and transform it into something else. You have something coming in and you want to change it before you actually can use it. And then you have a source and you want to insert your change document into this, into what comes in on your source port. Right, so this is the scenario. And I've mentioned all the port names there. So we have to, what comes in on the extra port, we have to put it on the source port of the attribute. What comes out of that result, we have to put it in the insertion port. So there are a lot of explicit port connections you have to make here. So how is this going to work? Right. What I want you to do is open the 05B. This, as you can see, because the numbering I added it at the last moment. Connect internal and try to change this pipeline so it actually does this. And it's not easy. See if you can do this. So let's have a look at the solution then, how this should look. The first thing is, of course, that we have something coming in on the extra port that we want to change. Right? But the extra port is not a primary port. So if you want to connect to that, we need an explicit connection. So we add an add attribute. It adds some extra attribute, doesn't matter what. And we add it using a P with input, and we explicitly connect to the extra port of the outer pipeline. That's the first thing, that's where the arrow ends, right? Okay.
Why do you have to give a name to? What does the name attribute mean?
The name
in the first add attribute element.
I get to that. The question was, what does the name attribute on the name attribute on the P add attribute doing there? What is it doing there? I'll get to that because it's important. So what we now do, we use this non-primary port. We put the input into the P add attribute, which adds an attribute, right? And okay. All right. Then we have a source port, which we have to, where we want, which the document that comes in there, we want to insert something in. But the P insert step is no longer the first step in your pipeline. So the implicit connection does no longer work. So what you should do, you should actually connect, as I did there, the source port of the outer pipeline explicitly to the source port of the P insert step. Implicit connections no longer work because it's no longer the first step in your pipeline. Right? And that's what the callout says. All right. So now we have connected the primary ports of our two steps. What comes out of the P add attribute needs to go into the insertion port of the P insert step. And that's why we have to name this P add attribute step, because otherwise we can't address its result port. We cannot connect to it. So we say, okay, the insertion port is connected to the result port of what we call change extra document. So this is the arrows show how the documents flow. And there's one implicit connection that still works, fine, which is this one, because P insert is the last step of your pipeline. What flows out of there flows automatically into the primary output port back to the world. So this is how you do these kinds of things if you want to connect to ports. This is getting a bit complicated. So any questions or remarks? Yeah, Nico.
Could you rewrite this so that the add attribute step is the last step, and then you explicitly route the output of the insert step to the output of the whole step you're declaring?
Yes, you can. You can also put a pipe attribute on the P output port declaration and get the output from somewhere else in your pipeline. Yes. All right. What's it? I always forget to repeat the questions, but okay. All right. Okay so far? Yeah. Good. Okay, so this is what we did. We talked about ports and implicit and explicit connections. Sorry, that should be explicit. Ports and explicit connections should be the title of the sheet. You can connect explicitly to an inline document. You can just write your XML inside P with input. You can connect to an external document using an href attribute, and you connect to somewhere else in your pipeline using a pipe attribute on the p-with input. That's how this works. All right, so that's how you connect ports together. That's a very important concept in XProc, of course. So let's switch to something else. Let's switch to options and variables, because we've seen already that a step can have options, right? So maybe if we write a step ourselves, we also want to use an option on that step. We also want to set an option on that step and do something with its value. And then, of course, the question comes after that: does XProc has a concept of variables? Yes, it has. I will show you. And a very important thing at the end is there are two ways to set options, and sometimes you need the second way, and then you have to be aware of something that it's tricky. But we'll get to that. Let's talk about options first. That's the easy part. What if you wanted to add an option to your own pipeline? You write a pipeline and you want some option that changes something it does. For instance, in this case, I added an option called username with a p option element, and you have to write it at the top of your pipeline somewhere. You have to add a p option. As the fish says, you can all do kinds of wonderful things with options. You can give the data type, you can limit values for it, lots of things, but I'm not going into that now. You have to read the specification if you want to know more about it. But what I did here was add a default value. So this means that if you do not explicitly set the username option, the default value will be Erik, which is of course a very nice value. And then I reference this option using, like an XSLT, a dollar in front. In this case, I add an attribute with the uppercase of the username to the document I put in. So that's just like XSLT, parameters in XSLT, actually options are quite comparable to parameters in XSLT.
So
Alright.
maybe I do have said it and missed it, but in fact, between the braces you have XPath expressions.
Yes.
That's what important.
Yeah, Peter had added the remark that what you put between curly braces is an XPath expression. And you can put any XPath expression there you want. Yeah, right. So here's another exercise for you. The first, this pipeline is actually just there. So you can 06 add option, you can just run it. And to set an option, you have to do it on the command line in this case. And you do that by, in this case, with minus option colon username is, and then add your own name and see if it comes out. After you've done that, I'm going to ask you to add a second option called a name, attribute name, that actually changes the name of the attribute you're going to add to the input document. So the attribute name is now username, but it could be anything.
There's a useful remark in the chat. The old Smati, how to pronounce. When I first learned XProc, I found it beneficial to start by converting all implicit connections to explicit elements and attributes. Once I figured out the explicit nomenclature, it then became safer and easier to drop it was needed.
Right. The remark is that you can make all implicit connection explicit by explicitly writing them on the P with input statements. Yes, you can do that, and there are people advocating that that's the way to learn XProc. For this tutorial, I chose to use as much syntactic sugar as we added to the language to make it easy and to lower the learning curve for now. But yes, if you get a little further, you might want to make want to make the implicit connections. Yeah, it's a didactical choice.
But another remark is that it helps if you name every step that you use. Because if you give it a good name, like a variable has a good name in documents, in fact.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah. The remark was that you might make the choice to name every step in your pipeline because it can also work as documentation. Yes, that's true. It's a programming style. Yeah.
There is some implicit conversion of parameters that you pass in. I assume, because when I input my nickname that is only numbers, then it fails.
Really?
Yeah, it says it cannot convert this number. X string is.
All right. I think that's I don't know. The question is if you put in a name with only numbers in it, the pipeline fails. Yes, there's probably it then takes it as an integer, but I'm not sure. That's probably a Morgana conversion thingy. I don't know.
Okay.
But maybe it's in. I don't know whether it's in the language or in Morgana. I'm not sure about that. Okay, so far?
I was just wondering why my name is uppercase, but there's the function.
Yeah. Okay. Let's have a look at the solution to this exercise. Okay. Yeah. So what you could actually do is add a second option, which is called a name, and by default it's set to username, and then you also make the attribute name an attribute value template by referring to the option, which of course means that then you have to put in a valid attribute name as the value of a name, but okay. Otherwise your pipeline will fail, but that's okay. Okay, let's have a look at the variables. XProc 1 had the quirk that you could only add variables at the top of your pipeline or at the top of a compound step like the group. That's no longer the case in XProc 3. You can add your variables anywhere, which is a good thing. In this case, I create a variable called ID. I'll get to the details later, which takes the username you put in as an option and does things with interesting things with it, does some things with it. And then you reference the variable with a dollar in front. I mean, like XSLT. That's probably not a surprise. And you can type your variables with an S, is X a string, or it is integer, or whatever you want. And variables can be of any type, any XDM type, so it can be element, document, attribute, whatever you want.
Map array?
Yeah.
Maps and arrays?
Maps and arrays, yes, sure. Any XPath 3.1 thingy. Yes. And what is this? This should be unknown to you. What XProc does, it adds a number of functions to the XPath function library, and which can tell you things about the XProc processor. You can ask for its name, etc. In loops, which we get, you can ask for the number of iterations in the loop, how far it is in the loop, stuff like that. There's some very specific functions for that. This function here, the p-system property returns, as it says, system properties, and in this case, the p-episode system property is a number that's guaranteed to be unique for every time the XProc processor runs. So in this case, it is not a UUID, it's just something, some string, but it's guaranteed to be unique. I'm not going into details about this function. If you want to have a look at that, there's a section in the specification about which functions there are in the XProc stand. The nice thing about variables is that there are not just variables you can set to a value, but you can take values from your documents flowing through your pipeline. So let's assume we have this document flowing through your pipeline. some pipeline, whatever pipeline. And you want to do something with the status, the value of the status attribute here. And it would be nice if you could put that value into a variable, because then it's easier to use it. Actually, that's really simple, because you just say, I have a variable, I name it status, and I select /* or /some root / status from it. So what actually happens, a variable sees the document that's flowing through it and can extract values from it, which is a useful treat. And any XPath expression there. For the advanced users, you can also make this variable declaration, have a look at other pieces in your pipeline, other documents, other ports. You can do wonderful things with it, but that's too advanced, I think, for today. So I will not get into that. Another exercise, yes. What I want you to do is go to 07 use variable and add a variable to this pipeline that catches the value of the presenter element, so the text contents of the presenter element. And after that, I want you to add this as an attribute to the root. What I say, I have a variable called presenter, and what I select from it is, in this case I was lazy, as I wrote / presenter1, but you could also have written another XPath expression that goes to the presenter element. And after that, I use it here as the value of the attribute value. What actually happens here is that what data type is the presenter variable? Element. Yeah, the data type of the presenter variable is element, and it gets stringified down there into its text contents. You could have made it an explicit string by typing as x as string as an x attribute. Be good.
I left out the match attribute, but it's still the same.
Yeah, the match attribute is optional, and it defaults to /*. Yeah, yeah, that's right. All right.
Question here.
Yeah.
The question is a variable limited to a string, or can it be an XML fragment, for example?
The question was what data type can the variable be? Anything in the XDM realm. So a string, an integer, a real, an element, a document, anything. Yeah. Here's an alternative if you didn't want to use the variable. Maybe you didn't realize, but what's in between these curly braces in your text value templates is actually an XPath expression. And the XPath expression context is the document flowing through. So you could have done this directly there. So if you only needed it once, you could have done it like this. So be aware. Yeah.
Isn't the context the path you have in match?
No. The context node for the XPath expressions is what comes in on the is what we call what comes in on the primary port in this case. Sorry. Yeah. The question. Yeah. The question was, isn't the context what is on the match attribute? The answer is no, it is not. It's what comes in on the primary port. Yeah. Or actually, it is the. Just leave it. Okay. Right. How can we set an option? We've already done it, so we know it, right? We can set options by putting an attribute on the step invocation, like we did with match and attribute name and attribute value in our examples so far. However, that works for data type that can be converted from a string. So if your option, for instance, is type integer, then you must make sure that what you put in that attribute can be converted to an integer, can be cast to an integer. Otherwise, I think it wouldn't work. Right. A nice thing about XProc, what we build in, is that if the data type of your option is a map or an array, then you can write the map or array expression directly as the value of your attribute, of your option attribute, like I did there. And this is, for instance, the parameters option is, for instance, how you pass parameters to a XSLT style sheet. You can immediately write the map construct there, but the options type must be a map or array, must be explicitly set to map or array on the step. So this works. This is okay for these things, but there are things you can't do. So there is a second way of setting options. This is with p with option, and here it gets a little tricky. So that's why the exclamation mark is there. This is the alternative for what I just did. So we had an attribute there at the top, and I translated this to 3 p with option statements down there. The select attribute of p with option is an XPath statement, so you have to be aware of that, because, for instance, if the attribute name should now be passed in as a string between single quotes inside the double quotes, or the other way around. But what happens here? This might look very weird, because we pass in an XPath expression as a string. Now, can anybody guess why that is? Probably you know it, but this has to do. Yeah, Yuri?
Yeah, well guess, because it would be evaluated at that point already, yeah, and then it wouldn't be evaluated at the later point.
It's a very good wild guess. Yeah. What you want here is you want the XPath expression /star to be evaluated by the step and not by the pipeline. Because think of what would happen if we left out these littles and not less single quotes and put it in as a real XPath expression /star. Then the pipeline said, the select expression contains an XPath expression, I'm going to evaluate that. Well, and since the option is a string, it's going to stringify your document. So what would then be passed into your p-add attribute step would be the string contents of your document. The p-add attribute step thinks it gets an XPath expression, but it just gets a string then, something, whatever is in your document. So that simply won't work. So you have to be aware that if you have XPath expressions going into a steps option, and you're using the p with option, you have to pass it in as a string. Something that is, especially when you start programming XProc, will go wrong a lot of times.
So you should use a variable for the value of match?
The question was, can you use a variable for the value of matching? The answer is yes. It's just a string. So you can compose, you can attribute value template there. It doesn't matter.
You looked at me and thought I knew, but I'm surprised. So.
It's a string,
yeah.
And the step interprets the string as an XPath expression. That's what happens. Right. So what I'm going to ask you to do, actually do this, just so you can get a feel for it. Open 08 use with option and replace all the attributes on add attribute by p with options elements.
And we get a question, why would I want to do this with the p option? Is it complicated?
Right. The question is, why would you want to anyway want to use p with option? I'm getting to that. Actually, it's this. One of the interesting things is that the attribute value thing is a string, so you actually explicitly need to cast the current date time to a string to make it work. Otherwise, you will get a type error in your pipeline. Probably you've seen it. Yeah. All right. And now to the answer to the question, or Norm already explained why you sometimes need p with option on the chat. I have my own sheet about it. Why would you want to do a p with option? Well, one of them is style. I mean, some people prefer explicitly writing things the long way. P with option may be somewhat more explicit. And there are some data type that you cannot pass in as an attribute. For instance, if the value of an option is a sequence of strings, you cannot pass in a sequence of strings through an attribute value. That will not work. So you have to do something like the bottom line there. This is, for instance, the case when you do I'm not sure about the exact name of the step, but there are steps to query a directory for all the files in it, and you can put filters in that, and the filters you put in are a sequence of strings, and you have to pass them in like this. I remember some very hot discussions in our editing committee about this, but this is the end result.
Am I right that the braces are slightly different interpretation than in XLT? Because in XLT, I believe the braces are always converted to text or string.
Right. Peter asked the exact meaning of text value templates actually with curly braces, and yes, we're doing things a little bit different than in XSLT. Actually, we're doing it the XQuery way. In XSLT, a text value template does the value of something, so it stringifies it. In XQuery, what you put between curly braces is actually a copy of semantics. So it actually copies the data type into your document at that moment. If it's an element, then the element will get in there. So we do it. XProc does it the XQuery way, the copy of semantics. Yes, it's different. Thank you. Yeah. All right. So this was just about options and variables. We've seen that we can add an option to our pipeline with a p option. We can reference it as if it was a variable. We can add variables with p variable. And we have another way to set options using p with options. P option. Any questions so far? Because now we're getting into, again, somewhat more complicated stuff. Right. Let's talk about compound steps. This is where the language actually gets interesting, of course. We're going to have a talk about compound steps, and the first question is, of course, what is a compound step? Oh, okay. A compound step is something you can do in your pipeline in the flow. For instance, you can have like in XSLT, you have the XSL:choose element to choose between various alternatives. In XProc, we have a p::choose, which works roughly the same way. We also have a p::if, and there are various other compound steps. So compound steps are the things in your pipeline where you can make decisions, loop over things, stuff like that. And these are the core steps, the core compound steps. There are, or actually the only compound steps. P for each is loops. It loops over multiple documents. Because what I haven't told you, you can push one document through a port, but it's also possible to push multiple documents through a port. And then you get multiple documents into, for instance, p at attributes, which won't work because it can't handle multiple documents. So you need to have a P for each loop that loops one by one over all the documents in what comes in on your port. It can also loop over parts of your documents, and I'm not sure whether we're going to get to that exercise, but there's an exercise about that in the sheets. There's the P-choose, as I already told you, P-when, P-otherwise. Looks actually exactly like the XSL choose if you're used to XSLT. There's a P-if. One of the things we're going to see is a P-viewport. P-viewport actually filters out one piece of your XML. So you can say, I just want a viewport on this part of my document. And I want to change only this part of your document and leave the rest alone. Very useful thing to do. P-try, P-catch, error handling. And there is a P-group, which is more or less a leftover from XProc 1, where you needed it in several cases, but it's no longer something you need very much in XProc 3. Nonetheless, it can be a documentation tool to group statements together and stuff like that. It's up to you. So let's have a look at one, the easy one. Let's have a look at the P-if. The P-if makes a decision, right? So what you put in the test attribute is like the same, is an XPath expression that should be castable as a Boolean, like you do an XSLT on the XSL if, and the code in there only tests when the expression is true. Interesting question is, of course, what happens when the expression is false. And actually, I'm going to thank Peter here, Peter Mazzareo, for suggesting this to us, which was an excellent suggestion. Because what we decided on, what happens if the test refers to false, is that actually nothing happens. The document falls out at the end. And it sounds very logical, but somehow it didn't got into our minds. But we decided on doing this, and it works. It's brilliant. So this is actually this is the P-if. This is all, right? So I want you just to do a little exercise on that. 09 use if. Write the pipeline so that if the status is error, it adds a special handling attribute to the root. Yes. The remark is that you cannot set an option twice, not as an attribute and with your PV option, but you can mix. You can set some attributes, some options using attributes, and some options with PV option. So, but not the same one twice. Thumbs up on the line. Right. This is not very difficult. Let's have a look at the solution. I mean, there's more than one way to do this, but here's my code. This works. You can write the ifs, you can write the test differently, you can do all kinds of things, but this is, at least this works. Okay. Given the P-if, it's no surprise that we also have a multiple decision tree, as I already told you, the P-choose. It looks like this. Actually, that's all. I'm not going to tell you more about it, and if you want to try it, just try it. An interesting step, an interesting step is the P for each, as I already told. P for each loops over things. Hey, morning, Jan. Welcome. What we're going to do is we're going to split a document into parts using the P for each. And what you see here is we have a document. We're going to split this into multiple documents. We're going to write actually these multiple documents to disk as separate documents. And as you can see, there is a file name attribute on every doc element that tells it how the output document should be called. So this is getting a little bit more advanced now. We're getting into things that can actually be useful. Yeah, the content is boring, says the fish, but the idea is not. Okay, Canava is an annoying fish. Okay, so how should this work? I'm not going to ask you to do this. Okay, here is the basic pipeline. So what is actually happening here? We have our input document coming through our source port, and it runs into the P for each. P for each has something which is called an anonymous input port. So actually, if you don't do anything, it's what comes in on the. But if you want to change it like we want to do here, it has an anonymous input word to which you can take care of what comes in on the for each. And what you're actually saying to pay for each, okay, what you get on your primary port, please use / doc about it and split the document into separate doc elements. So what happens here is that the pay for each loop will start looping over, loops twice, once over the first doc element and then over the second doc element. Yep. So, as I said, this is it has an anonymous input port anyway, but what the fish says is to select is a standard attribute of P with input. So if you have a document flowing in through with P with input, for instance with a pipe attribute or something, you can also do a select on that if you, for instance, want a part of your document. But that's a bit of an advanced usage of it. In this case, we're splitting the document, right? Because / docs returns a sequence of doc elements. And then we're going to use one of the other standard steps of XProc, which is the pstore, which, no surprise, stores your document to disk. And the name under which it does is in its href option, and it says, okay, please use the file name of your doc, of the doc element we've just split out. And pstore has the nice feature that it emits on its result port exactly the same document as it got on the result port, exactly the same document as it gets in on its source port. It actually, for Unix users, works as a T command. So you push the document in, same document comes out, and it writes it to disk. That's the whole idea of pstore. All right, so what I want you to do now is this. And you're going to run into an error, which is deliberate. Would you please try to run exercises 10 for each? So, who has the error message? Yeah. Can anybody explain the error message? Yeah?
Well, the pipeline returns more than one item in the sequence.
Yes, it returns a sequence of documents because out of the for each flows a sequence of documents. And our result port is configured in such a way that it will reject a sequence of documents. But luckily we can change that. And what you can do is make the result port of your pipeline accept a sequence by setting sequence is true on the output port declaration of your pipeline. Could you try that? And then rerun the pipeline.
The question is, does the for each assume each context is document rather than say an element?
The question was, does the for each get a document or an element as its primary? Yes, it's a document. It's always a document. Yeah, it's a document node that flows through. All right, have you tried this? Probably, it's easy. So how many documents now flow out? 2, right? Okay.
So we have here both an output, and it writes 2 files. It creates 2 files.
Yes.
So the files are created with the store element, and the output is with input.
Yeah, the remark is we have a pipeline that emits and gets things through ports, emits an output through a port, but also writes files. Yes. One of the things I found in real life XProc very handy for also is for housekeeping files, for instance, deleting stuff, creating directories and stuff. You can all do that in XProc. And this is just a little example of what you can do with files. But there are more things you can do with files and directories and stuff.
I got a question, Erik, if you want to not to do this document, is there a way to ignore them, set them to the null file so to speak?
Yes, there's a piece for the question was, can you get away with with outputs or stuff flowing through your pipeline? Yes, there's for instance a psync step that just eats whatever it gets on its source port and throws it away. Yeah.
And then you have to leave out the P output on the top.
Or then you have to leave. Yeah, you have to leave out the P output on the port. You can write steps without an output port. It's entirely possible and even useful sometimes.
Another question: is it possible to create multiple documents just by using XSLT? Because I think I tried to do that some years ago, and there was no solution for that.
And the question is, can you create multiple documents using XSLT? Well, it's actually an XSLT question, but the answer is yes. There is an XSL result document instruction in which you can write documents out of your XSLT. Yeah.
But it's only in the newer.
Yeah, only in the 3.0. Yeah, I think 2.0. XSL result document is was that into the
XSL result document, and then if you want to deal with them in XProc, you have to catch them in the
yeah, that's too advanced for now.
Okay.
Yeah, 5 minutes. All right, I'll wrap up. This was a solution. We could add the sequences to attribute, which probably you all did. No surprise. And it makes the output accept the sequence. As the fish says, you can even tune your ports even better. You can also tell them, for instance, what MIME types of documents a port should accept or not. So you can make your pipeline even safer by, for instance, saying you should only accept XML documents. Stuff like that. There are ways to do that. And again, what flows out of here is a sequence of documents. Let me introduce one more step, finally, as the last thing, is that, for instance, if you want these two documents that now flow out of your for each back into one document, there's a step for that, which is called wrap sequence. So a sequence of documents comes in, sequence of documents comes in, and the result is wrapped, and you say just what element you want to round it. You can add in the wrapper. The wrapper option tells you tells the step how the element should be called that will be wrapped around your sequence of documents. Group adjacent will not get into that, too complicated for now. Here's a hands-on, but I think we're going to skip this because of the time. And there are some additional exercises and stuff like that, for instance, with viewport, they're introducing some stuff. So I'll quickly get up to the end. We've reached the end of the tutorial. What have we seen? We've seen XProc. We've seen XProc has steps, pipelines, interchangeable things. We have ports, right? We have primary ports with implicit connection. We also have explicit connections to stuff, and we need that. And there are options and variables and several ways how to set them. And there are compound steps. And as the fish says, there's much, much more to explore, of course. I would say goodbye. Thank you all. There are two processor implementations, as I say, Morgana you're using now, which is ready, and Calabash, which is almost ready. There is a program reference, of course. This is the commercial part of the tutorial, right? There's a program reference. You can buy it online, but you can buy it from me now. I have 4 copies with me. If you want to, for 25 euros, which is a bargain. And of course, very important, there are free Canava stickers. I thank you very much for your attendance, and if you have any more questions, I will be happy to answer them.